In 1969, Neville Goddard opened an old Bible and found 2 letters from his teacher Abdullah, letters he'd kept for nearly 40 years, letters he'd never shared with anyone. He mentioned this discovery in one of his lectures, but when he did, he made a strange choice. He told his audience that the first portion of those instructions were, quote, all very technical in Hebrew, and wouldn't interest them. He moved on, changed the subject, and nobody pushed back. But here's what researchers have since discovered. Those technical Hebrew instructions weren't just interesting, they were the missing framework that explains why Neville's techniques work brilliantly for some people and completely fail for others. Neville simplified his teacher's system to make it accessible, and in doing so, he left out the one piece that actually makes it work consistently. I'm going to show you what that missing piece is, not because I want to criticize Neville. His work changed my life, but because I think you deserve to know why you might be doing everything right and still not seeing results. And once you understand this, a lot of things are going to click into place. So let's start with what actually happened in 1969. Neville was going through his old Bible, looking for something unrelated, when he found these 2 letters from Abdullah tucked inside. Abdullah had given them to him back in 1930 or 1931. They were falling apart. Molding. Neville had completely forgotten they existed. And when he mentioned them in his lecture, he made a choice. He decided to share some portions but skip others. His exact words were that the first portion was all very technical in Hebrew and wouldn't interest his audience. Now think about that for a second. This is a man who spent 5 years studying with Abdullah, 5 years of daily lessons, 5 years learning Hebrew, Kabbalah, and esoteric Bible interpretation. And at the end of all that training, Abdullah gave him written instructions, a document important enough that Neville kept it in his Bible for 4 decades. And Neville's conclusion was that the technical parts wouldn't interest people. I don't think he was being dishonest. I think he genuinely believed that, but I also think he was wrong. Because those technical parts, they're the operating system. And what Neville taught publicly was the application layer. You can use an application without understanding the operating system. Sometimes it works fine. But when something goes wrong, when the app crashes or freezes or just doesn't respond the way it should, you have no idea how to fix it. You just keep clicking the same buttons, hoping for a different result. That's what's happening to most people who try Neville's techniques. They're clicking buttons on an application they don't understand, and when it doesn't work, they assume they're doing something wrong. Or worse, they assume the whole thing is nonsense. But the problem isn't the technique. The problem is they're missing the foundation. So what was in those technical Hebrew instructions? We don't have the letters themselves. They may have been lost after Neville died in 1972. But we know what Abdullah taught because Neville talked about their 5 years together in multiple lectures. And when you cross-reference what Neville described with traditional cabalistic training, a very clear picture emerges. Abdullah wasn't teaching Neville random mystical concepts. He was teaching him a complete system, a system with multiple phases that had to be completed in order. Neville learned Hebrew, not conversational Hebrew, but the mystical meanings behind each letter. In Kabbalah, the Hebrew alphabet isn't just a writing system. Each letter is considered a creative force, a building block of reality itself. When you understand the letters, you understand how reality is structured. He learned the Sephirot. These are 10 attributes or emanations that describe how consciousness manifests into physical form. Think of them as the architecture of creation, the blueprint that explains how thought becomes thing. He learned esoteric Bible interpretation, how to read scripture not as history or morality, but as a psychological manual. Every character, every story, every number representing states of consciousness you can enter and exit. And he learned something else, something Neville rarely mentioned explicitly in his public lectures. He learned purification. In Hebrew, it's called Tikkun, and it's the missing piece that explains everything. Here's the problem Neville never adequately addressed. If imagination creates reality, and you're imagining good things, why isn't your life good? If feeling is the secret, and you're generating positive feelings, why do negative circumstances keep showing up? The standard Neville answer is that you're not doing it right. You're not truly feeling it. You're not persisting long enough. You're not fully occupying the state. And sometimes that's true. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes people do everything correctly and still get inconsistent results. I've seen it. You've probably experienced it. Tikkun explains why. The concept is straightforward once you hear it. Before you can use your imagination to create effectively, you have to clean it up. Before you can use your emotions to impress the subconscious mind, you have to purify them. Think of it like a musical instrument. You can know exactly what song you want to play. You can have perfect technique. But if the instrument is out of tune, the music will sound wrong. It doesn't matter how skilled you are. A corrupted instrument produces corrupted output. Your imagination and emotions are instruments, and for most people, they're significantly out of tune. Tikkun has multiple layers. The first is Tikkun Hamido, which translates roughly to rectification of emotional traits. This isn't about suppressing emotions or pretending to feel things you don't. It's about identifying where your emotional responses have become distorted and bringing them back into balance. For example, let's say you're trying to manifest financial abundance. You do your visualization every night. You feel wealthy. You assume the wish fulfilled. But underneath that, you have unexamined beliefs about money. Maybe you grew up believing rich people are greedy. Maybe you saw your parents fight about bills and developed anxiety around finances. Maybe you have a deep-seated feeling that you don't deserve abundance. These distortions don't disappear just because you're visualizing. They're running in the background, and they're corrupting the signal. It's like trying to send a clear radio transmission while there's interference on the line. The message gets garbled. What arrives isn't what you sent. The second layer is Tikkun Hadimyon, rectification of imagination itself. This is even more subtle. Most people's imagination isn't actually under their control. It's reactive. It responds to fears, anxieties, desires, and external stimuli. You might sit down to imagine your ideal life, but within seconds your mind has wandered to worries about work, or replaying an argument from last week, or fantasizing about revenge against someone who wronged you. That's not a trained imagination. That's a wild imagination. And a wild imagination creates wild, unpredictable results. True imaginative control means you can hold a single image infused with a single feeling for an extended period without distraction. Not fighting against other thoughts, but genuinely having no other thoughts arise. That's a skill. And it requires training that Neville never explicitly provided. Here's where it gets really interesting. In 1946, a man named Israel Regardie wrote an essay analyzing Neville's teaching. He was one of the most respected occultists of the 20th century. He'd been Aleister Crowley's personal secretary. He'd studied and practiced nearly every Western esoteric tradition, and he personally knew Neville. His assessment was brutally honest. He said Neville's system was the most evidently magical of any metaphysical approach he'd encountered. High praise from someone who'd seen everything, but then he pointed out the problem. Because it was so magical, it required systematic training that Neville wasn't providing. Regardie wrote that the average person's mind had become entirely too prosaic, and their feelings too inhibited to use imagination the way Neville described. They needed what he called training in the art of letting go, in the discipline of feeling, and in the analysis of psychological states. Neville heard this criticism. He never publicly addressed it. And I think that's because he couldn't address it without fundamentally restructuring his teaching. See, Neville made a choice early in his career. He chose accessibility over completeness. He wanted to reach as many people as possible. He wanted to share a message of hope and empowerment, and he genuinely believed that if people just heard the truth about imagination, they would be transformed. For some people, that worked. Neville attracted students who were ready, people whose instruments were already relatively tuned, people who had done their inner work through other means, or who were naturally gifted, or who just had less psychological baggage to work through. For those people, Neville's simplified teaching was enough. They heard feel it real, and they could actually do it. They heard live in the end, and they naturally shifted into that state. But for most people, it didn't work that way. They understood the concept intellectually, but couldn't execute it consistently. And without the purification framework, they had no way to diagnose what was going wrong. So what do you actually do with this information? Let me give you the practical application, because understanding the problem is only useful if you know how to solve it. The first step is honest self-assessment, and I mean brutally honest. You need to identify your emotional distortions around whatever you're trying to manifest. Not the surface level stuff you tell yourself, but the deep programming that's actually running. Let's say you want a relationship. On the surface, you believe you deserve love. You visualize a partner, you feel the feelings. But when you really examine yourself, what do you find? Maybe you believe that love always leads to pain. Maybe you think you have to give up your freedom to be with someone. Maybe you're terrified of being truly seen because you think if someone knew the real you, they'd leave. Those beliefs don't show up in your visualization. They're not what you consciously think about, but they're there, and they're shaping your reality more than any scene you imagine before sleep. The cabalistic approach would have you identify these distortions through careful self-observation. Watching your reactions, noticing what triggers you, paying attention to the stories you tell yourself about why things happen. It's not fast. It's not a hack. It's actual inner work. And most people don't want to do it because it's uncomfortable. It's much easier to visualize a mansion than to confront why you feel fundamentally unworthy of one. The second step is what I'd call emotional alchemy. This is where you actually transform distorted emotional patterns instead of just covering them up. There's a big difference between suppressing fear and resolving it. Suppressed fear doesn't disappear, it just goes underground. It influences you from the shadows, and it corrupts your manifestations in ways you can't consciously detect. True transformation means sitting with the emotion fully, not running from it, not bypassing it with positive thinking, actually feeling it, understanding its origin, and allowing it to complete its cycle. This is the opposite of what most manifestation teaching tells you. Most teachers say avoid negative emotions at all costs, don't entertain them, replace them with positive ones immediately, but that's bypassing, not healing. And bypassing creates the exact kind of emotional distortion that prevents manifestation from working. Abdullah was apparently ruthless about this. There's a famous story Neville told about wanting to visit his family in Barbados but having no money. When he brought this problem to Abdullah, expecting guidance or sympathy, Abdullah simply said, "You are in Barbados." When Neville came back the next week to discuss it more, Abdullah slammed the door in his face, called him stupid, refused to entertain any conversation about the problem. On the surface, this looks like harsh teaching about living in the end. And it is. But there's something underneath. Abdullah wasn't just telling Neville to ignore reality. He was demanding that Neville not indulge in the emotional pattern of lack and longing. Every time Neville wanted to discuss his situation, he was reinforcing the emotional state of not having, and Abdullah refused to participate in that reinforcement. The door slamming wasn't cruelty. It was intervention. Abdullah was breaking the cycle that was keeping Neville stuck. Most manifestation teachers today would never do this. They'd let you process your feelings. They'd validate your struggle. They'd give you techniques to manage doubt. And in doing so, they'd keep you locked in the very state you're trying to escape. I'm not saying Abdullah's approach is right for everyone. It's severe. It requires a level of readiness that most people don't have, but it reveals something important about what was actually being taught behind closed doors. Neville softened this considerably for public audiences. He made it supportive, encouraging, patient, and I think that was partly compassion and partly practicality. You can't slam doors on people in a lecture hall, but something got lost in the translation, the intensity. the absolute refusal to tolerate the old state, the demand for complete, immediate transformation rather than gradual improvement. The third step is training your imagination directly. This is where most people start, but it should actually come later. Trying to control your imagination before you've dealt with your emotional distortions is like trying to drive a car with a dirty windshield. You might make progress, but you can't see clearly where you're going. Once your emotional patterns are cleaner, imagination training becomes much easier. The wild mind settles down. Intrusive thoughts decrease. You can actually hold a scene without it morphing into something else. The traditional practices for this are simple but demanding. Visualization exercises where you hold a single image with perfect clarity for increasing periods of time, starting with 30 seconds, working up to several minutes, then longer, not visualizing a whole movie. Not jumping from scene to scene, one image, held perfectly, with complete sensory detail, without wavering. When Neville talked about falling asleep in the wish fulfilled, he was assuming you could do this. He was assuming you had the ability to hold a state while crossing the threshold into sleep. For untrained people, that's extremely difficult. Your mind wanders. Random images intrude. The emotional tone shifts without you noticing. The cabalistic training would have prepared you for this. Not as a manifestation technique, but as a foundational skill developed long before you ever tried to create anything specific. Let me give you something you can actually use. Before your next visualization session, take 10 minutes to do an emotional inventory. Ask yourself honestly, what do I really believe about this desire? Not what I want to believe. What I actually believe when I'm not trying to be positive. Write it down, don't judge it, just observe it. Then ask, where did this belief come from? Usually it's childhood. Usually it's something that happened before you had the capacity to evaluate it critically. A comment from a parent, an experience that left a mark, something you absorbed from your environment without choosing it. Once you see the origin, the belief starts to lose its grip. It's not truth, it's not fundamental reality, it's just a program that got installed when you were too young to say no. You don't have to fight the belief. You don't have to affirm the opposite aggressively. Just seeing it clearly begins to dissolve it. Do this consistently, every day, for a few weeks. Watch what happens to your visualization practice. Watch how much easier it becomes to hold the state. Watch how your manifestations start to reflect what you actually want instead of what you secretly fear. This is the work Neville didn't teach publicly. Not because he was hiding it, but because he genuinely believed most people wouldn't be interested in the technical Hebrew instructions. He thought they just wanted results. And he was right. Most people do just want results. That's why most people get inconsistent results. The ones who are willing to do the deeper work, to clean the instrument before trying to play it, those are the ones who experience what Neville talked about, the seemingly miraculous shifts. The rapid manifestations, the sense that reality is genuinely responding to consciousness. It's not magic in the supernatural sense, it's precision. It's removing the interference that was scrambling the signal. It's bringing the instrument into tune so the music actually sounds like what you intended. Neville gave you the song, Abdullah gave him the tuning process, and now you have both. One more thing before we wrap up. Later in his life, Neville said something about Abdullah that most people miss. He said Abdullah understood the law, not the promise. The law is manifestation. Using imagination to shape your physical reality. Get what you want, change your circumstances, improve your life. The promise is something different. It's a mystical awakening that Neville experienced starting in 1959, a series of visions and realizations that he considered more important than any manifestation he'd ever achieved. After those experiences, Neville's teaching shifted. He started saying things like, you can use this to make a fortune, but that's not your true purpose here. What's fascinating is that Neville discovered something beyond what his teacher knew. Abdullah gave him the law, the complete system for manifesting. But the promise Neville had to discover on his own. This tells me that even the complete cabalistic training is still just a foundation. It's not the destination. It's preparation for something larger. But you can't skip to that something larger. You have to build the foundation first. You have to master the law before you're ready for the promise. You have to clean your instrument before you can hear the music clearly enough to recognize what it's really playing. Most people want the advanced stuff. They want the mystical experiences. They want the cosmic consciousness. But they haven't done the basic work of getting their own psychology in order. Start where you are. Do the emotional inventory. Train your imagination. Apply the purification principles. Master the law first. The promise will come when you're ready. And you'll know you're ready because you'll stop asking for it. If this gave you a new way to think about why manifestation works or doesn't work, you'll probably want to see my video on the observer effect, specifically how your focus actually changes the behavior of people around you. That one goes deep into the mechanics of how consciousness influences physical reality.